Well, welcome back, everyone. We're on episode 6. My name is Cindi Meyersohn. I'd love to introduce Dan Linstedt to you. Dan, can you say hi and we'll talk about where we're going?
Hi, everybody. How you doing today?
We have been dealing with a number of different topics, basically looking at the business. In episode 1, we started talking about why Datavault was created. We've been highlighting a few of the risks that it mitigates against. Some of them business risk, some of them technical risk. Then we continued with episode 2. We talked about compliance and auditability and how Datavault addresses that inherently. In episode 3, we touched on KPAs, key process areas, and key process indicators, which are used in the business. Those are business terminology. So those things might have been new to the technical side, but how historical data can be used by the business in its decision-making process. We sometimes hear that the historical data is not as valuable as the current data, and that is not necessarily the case. It really does depend on what we're looking at. In episode 4, we talked about data acquisition and data merger or integration. We talked about data divestiture, which would be archiving data and when to do so. In episode 5, we talked about the business aspects of mergers and acquisitions and how Datavault helps support those particular business activities. We also talked about Datavault's application in startups with regard to venture capital funding and how Datavault might support those types of activities and operations. When we wrap into Datavault with episode 6, one of the things we wanted to do with this episode is really to get back to why Datavault is important to the business. And part of that has to do with also understanding who Dan Linstedt really is. We want to talk about Dan's position with regard to what does it mean to be the creator, the author, the inventor of Datavault, to go back to where did Datavault come from and why was it actually created. Dan, I'm going to put you back on the hot seat sort of as we go forward today. If I was a business, and I've heard these last 5 episodes and I'm hearing terms I've heard before, as a business, why do I care who Dan Linstedt is? Why is that important to look at Datavault seriously as a strategic methodology to help solve my business problems and reduce my business risk?
There's a lot to it. I want to talk a little bit about what you said in terms of the Datavault being important and where it came from and all of that. Part of that discussion is to call out to our authorized training partners. We have 4 of them around the world today. We have Data Rebels, of course, run by you, and we have Performance G2 run by Mark Schultze here in the US or North America. And then we have Certus in Australia and Asia Pac. They also handle New Zealand. And we have ScaleFree handling most of Europe. We have an authorized set of training partners. One of the reasons why is because we have this need for authorized trainers. This goes back to the standards are extremely rigorous. There is a lot of engineering and science and business knowledge backing the standards in Datavault. This goes back to the stories I told about Lockheed Martin and the stories I told about auditability and some of the other customers that we mentioned along the way in the podcast series. The customers, the Fortune 500s, the Fortune 50s, even the small companies that want to do Datavault, they want to do it right. They gain huge benefits when they do it properly. And that speaks volumes about the engineering and the standards that are behind it. And so I want to step back and say, well, you can't really have good standards that don't, quote, stand the test of time, that aren't rigorous. If you have standards that aren't rigorous, if you allow mom, pop, or anybody who walks in the front door to, quote, teach your class without a full level of understanding, without background, without knowledge, then you really can't echo the right message to the students. You can't help the students create successes. You can't help the businesses, our listeners, to create successes. A little bit about that. Authorized training partners are companies that have, well, authorized trainers. And those authorized trainers, they go through a series of rigor. First, they're required to work with Datavault for at least 5 years. And when I say work with, I mean build on-site, prove success after success after success, that they can uphold the standards that they can implement. And then we talk to those customers to say, how is it going? Has the person that taught you this course worked with you over the course of the last 5 years? And are you seeing successes and building forward? And are your teams working together well and all of that? So there's a lot of rigor there. Then you might be accepted into the authorized training program. Then from there, you have to work for a year or two shadowing and learning the materials themselves and learning the ins and outs of the standards and learning how to teach. And of course, knowing how to teach is not necessarily a skill that you can learn. In some cases, you either have it or you don't. In other cases, you have it and you need some refinement around how you present. And so we work with the instructors to bring them up to speed, to make sure that the rigor is there in the way they train, in the standards they teach, in the methods and the representation of the standards and everything that we have, that we've worked so hard to build. I mentioned this in one of the first episodes. I spent from 1990 to 2000 at Lockheed with a team of people building Datavault, building 30,000 test cases against Datavault. And it's not just data test cases. These are methodology test cases. Were we agile enough? Did we deliver on time? Answering questions like that. How many problems rolled into production that we had to go back and re-engineer? Is that number good enough? And that's applying Six Sigma logic and other things. It goes way beyond the model. This is what it means to have solid standards that stand the test of time. And we're sitting there today now. It's been 22 years since I've released the original standards. And in the original standards, when I first came to the market, the only thing that the market was ready to hear was about the Datavault model.
You came out of Lockheed in around the late 1990s, early 2000s with Datavault. What is it about you when you begin to talk about Datavault and you mentioned standards? Can't standards come from anywhere? What is the significance of Dan Linstedt saying these are the standards that have been introduced, unfortunately, into the industry around Datavault that are actually in contrast to some of the things that you discovered and tested inside of Lockheed?
I think that there's a difference in the rigor that's applied. Standards by consensus are one thing. If you do standards by consensus, you kind of all gather around and agree. It's not really a standard unless it's backed by rigorous testing. This is the difference. It's a best practice. Now, there are a lot of best practices out there, and best practices can vary and often do from client to client. It's okay to vary the best practices for specific needs. That's how you adapt and evolve certain applications and applied sciences and ideas and concepts to make them work for the business that you're building in. But when it comes to a standard, everybody needs to have a set standard, and you cannot manage standards by consensus. We applied the scientific method for the standards that we built, which means we had a control, and then we had the new potential standard that we wanted to implement, and we wanted to see how it would perform against the control. We looked at everything, like I said, 30,000 different test cases, everything from scalability to repeatability to maintainability to augmentation to quickness and release and reduced number of errors in production and estimate versus actuals. Those are the KPAs and KPIs. I mean, we looked at it all from the top down, and we tested and we tested and we tested and we reduced and we automated and everything else. And the analogy is similar to that of a stoplight. Everybody who knows what a car is around the world probably has seen a stoplight at an intersection and probably knows red, yellow, green. The quote accepted standard for red, yellow, green is worldwide, regardless of the language you speak. Green means go. It is your right of way. Yellow means caution, warning, slow down and stop if you're not yet in the intersection. Red means you better be stopped, or someone coming the other way with a green is probably either going to broadside you or take you out. Potential loss of life if you run a red, right? And so this is the whole nature of red, yellow, green. It's an accepted standard. What do you think would happen if a bunch of people in a small city got together and decided by consensus that red meant something different? Red meant go, yellow meant we don't care, and green meant stop. And then visitors come to the town. and they don't know about this standard. And all of a sudden they're running through greens, and you know what? You change the standard, the whole system would fall down. And this is part of the problem with standards by consensus. They're not backed by rigor. They're not backed by tests. They're not backed by verification. They're not backed by numbers and science. This is what I have a real problem with. I always tell people, or have always told people, look, it's okay to innovate the standards. It's okay to have new ideas. If you're going to come with a new standard suggestion, and please do, that's how we move forward. But if you're going to come with the test cases behind it, do the rigor, try it out with big data, try it out with small teams and big teams and split teams and geographical changes. And not many people have, I guess, the drive or the desire. They just come up with this new idea and it works in this one edge case. So therefore they say, well, it's good for the world, and they publish, and then the world takes it and it fails miserably. And this is the problem I have with this haphazard approach of, hey, look, here's an idea. And look, it should be a standard in Datavault. That's not how any of this works.
As the author, as the creator of Datavault, I do know that you uphold the standards, you teach the standards to all of your authorized trainers, and we have and hold a responsibility to deliver the standards to our students, which kind of brings me to, how does a business know where to get appropriate training? You've already mentioned that through the ATPs, in which are basically the funnels for connecting a potential student with a certified Datavault 2 instructor. But if I step back from that, because there is a world of training out there, and I think it's important for the business to know why they should care, who is training their people, and where the training is coming from. I look at this from some of the promises, if you will, or the benefits of Datavault. Why is it important to the business? Why should they care about I will say, the breadth of the training that their students receive versus focusing on the model? Can you talk about what that impact is to the business? Why is it important, and why should they care?
I'm going to use an analogy here, and then maybe we can talk about some of the business cases as well. But the business deserves value from its investment. They really shouldn't invest tons of money in something, and then whoever's making the claim builds a failure and is out of there because all they care about is the cash. And I see that happen over and over and over again with consultancies around the world. And it's unfortunate. And some consultants, they ride the rodeo. They think, they're all that in a bag of chips, and they think they're the superstar. And they walk in there and say, well, I can build it. And then they build it, and the customer gets unhappy, terminates the contract. And then before you know it, Datavault has a bad name. But it's not the fault of Datavault. It's the fault of the people who are building it. They haven't taken time to understand the standards, or they understand the standards. They don't want to follow the standards properly. We have this saying, Datavault's done right everywhere, every time. To do the standards right doesn't mean that you have to be part of any exclusive club. That's not how this works either. It just means that you can't be lazy. And humans by nature are lazy. They want to cut corners all the time. So there's two analogies here. Now, if you were in need of brain surgery, and you went in to your local physician, would you trust your local general practitioner to do the brain surgery on you? Or would you rather have someone that is specialized and trained and has studied for years on the best practices and the standards on how to operate on the human brain? In other words, would you want the top of the top, the cream of the crop? Would you be willing to pay the extra money to get the right person to do the job for brain surgery? What are your risks of getting someone who's, quote unquote, a general practitioner, or someone who says, I can do the brain surgery? You want to plunk your life in their hands. You want to plunk all this money down, and you walk in there and you never come out. That's the worst case, right? You die on the operating table. Maybe you come out, but you come out paralyzed. There's lots of different varying conditions that can happen if you don't choose the right authoritative source for brain surgery. And I hate to use that kind of analogy, but that's really what that means, right? There's another analogy that we can use and talk about the building of a 50-story, 100-story skyscraper. You want to lay a foundation. What do you think would happen if the contractors, they know what the standards are for the concrete, the mix for the foundation of the concrete that need to be, how deep it needs to be, how thick it needs to be, how hot and cold the mixture needs to be when they pour it, how liquidy and how consistent it needs to be when they pour it. They know the chemical mix that it needs to be. If they cut corners because it saves them a few bucks, what do you think would happen to the skyscraper long after they lay the foundation? Well, as soon as they start building the skyscraper, significant amount of weight, the foundation breaks down, the skyscraper falls, kills lots of people. So people's lives are at risk when standards are cut in certain industries. The business really deserves a working system. And when we're talking about analytics, strangely enough, there are certain businesses, certain government agencies where analytics can make a decision, a difference, and the way the analytics are built and the quality that's behind them can make a difference in someone's life. So if I come back to the business value, the standards help the person building the system or the team building the system to really do it right the first time so that it scales, so they don't have to re-engineer it, and so that they can connect to business concepts and business constructs. What's interesting is the businesses, they don't have any visibility into where their business is broken. And part of the standards with Datavault really shine a light on these things that are cracks in the business foundation, in the business operations. And that's really what the Datavault is all about, is to try and bring all of that together and create a solid foundation from which an enterprise solution, analytic solution, can actually be created.
One of the things that was different that I really attracted me, as a system integrator, was for the first time, I really saw a solution that emphasized the business, like understanding business concepts, driving those concepts forward to attach to, say, the business processes. It was just fascinating to me to sort of draw that line from the business concept and the terminology that the business used, because there's always this disconnect. I see one of the really important values of Datavault coming in that it drives business language to be cross-functional. Not only is the business speaking the same language in terms of its main business areas and processes in those main business areas, but that's reflected in the way IT begins to speak to the business. So you have an agreed upon language, which I always felt was crucial to making sure that the outcomes that we're delivering match the expectations of the business in their own terms. I've always said the thing about Datavault is it is and always has been and always will be about the business. It takes that bottom-up approach from the business concept, meeting that top-down approach from the technical aspect. I think that's something. And then it sort of aligns, I guess, the language across the entire organization. The other thing, too, that I think I'd like you to touch on has to do with this idea that we've been hearing for, probably over a decade of continuous improvement in the enterprise, and how Datavault actually feeds that desire that the enterprise has for continuous improvement. And I'm not just talking about in their IT systems or in their data warehouse, but continuous improvement across the entire enterprise. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Business. One of the things at Lockheed, and I mentioned this before, Lockheed is 7 sectors, and you've got electronics, you've got astronautics, you've got aeronautics. Each sector is responsible for its own stuff. The sectors don't really commingle with their data sets or their operational systems or even their people. So it's an interesting environment. However, that said, electronics sector might have 20 companies or 10 companies in it, and there are 53 companies all managed by profit and loss. Now, this was the 90s. The numbers, I'm sure, have changed by now, but this is the way the company was structured in the 90s. Electronics would build certain parts for astronautics and for aeronautics, but that's the nature of a divisional company. And you look at Lockheed, and back then it was 159,000 employees worldwide. You have to look at analytics from a business perspective, but at different levels of the ontology. You have to break the business down. There's obviously the board of directors is the very top of the ontology at the people level. And this brings to bear the people, the process, and the technology, the 3 components that we talk about as being part of Datavault. So at Lockheed, you've got the board of directors, they want one set of answers at a certain level, a certain grain. And then you've got the CEOs. Yep, there are multiple. There's one CEO in each of the 53 companies I mentioned, and they all want their own reports as to how their own company is doing. And sometimes they're partnered up with other companies for a specific product, and they want to know jointly how that's doing. Companies within companies is the way Lockheed is structured, and IT is the ring around the collar. You can't get anything done without standards. You can't get anything done without a consistent methodology. You have to prove that IT really is operating as a business. To do that, you have to prove where your money is being spent. You have to prove your budget. You have to achieve estimate versus actual ratios that are mostly accurate, 90% and above. Otherwise, you don't get funded next quarter, next year. If you don't get funded, well, then you end up on someone else's project. Instead of a lead, you're now a worker bee. And that's the way it used to work. But the whole point was, if you look at astronautics, what do? They launch rockets into space. Some of those rockets have payloads. Some of the payloads were at the time the shuttle missions. So the shuttle itself was a payload, and the humans. We have other payloads as part of other rocket missions, including satellites that orbit the Earth for communications and stuff like that. And of course, at the time, they were building the International Space Station. So they're still doing that, I think. So some of the times the rockets were launched autonomously from the ground to have parts to deliver to the International Space Station. When you look at analytics, you've got people asking questions about rockets and about parts and about payloads and these are all business terms. How much did it cost? How many people were on that project? Did we plan it properly? How many times did we go from planning to manufacturing and back to planning? And how many errors were built? We built this circuit board 15 times and threw it away 14 times. Why? What's the cost there? Well, what is the circuit board? The circuit board is a part number with a model number, with a version number and a date stamp. You have real world physical things that you're building in this case, and you have all this data that travels with those real world things. One of these pieces is central to how Datavault works in terms of addressing the business, and it's what you brought up. We had to look at Lockheed as a business and track a rocket build. A rocket is a rocket is a rocket. Every rocket has a part number. This is where you get master data from. If you start thinking master data, now it isn't so much master data as it is master concept, master business concept. And that's really what it's about. How do you identify or how do you tie all of this data to a business concept that then has a dollar figure and a people figure and an investment cost and an outcome and dates and processes and all that stuff behind it? In Lockheed and astronautics alone, we ingested only 153 of the 225 different source systems that astronautics used. And I can hear some of you guys going, oh my God, really? Yes, really. This is how big they were. How do you track a rocket through 153 different source systems? And before someone says, hey, look, there's a key on that rocket. Yeah, but that key, every time the data went from one operational system to another, and we had probably as many, if not more, operational applications that we had purchased, everything from Windchill to SAP to PeopleSoft to Oracle Finance and on and on and on. I mean, we had Pick Universe databases, for God's sake, for those of you that remember that. Every time the data traveled from one application to another, that whole key and all of its structure changed. So how do you trace an entire rocket through the build process? How do you produce analytics at the business level, at the corporate level, at the C level, at the board level, without understanding the business concept and what technically would tie that data directly, or all of that data and all of the iterations of that data to that business concept? And this is the power of the Datavault done right. So when the Datavault is done right, it's focused on that singular business concept. Now, for the rocket example, we had, like I said, 153 source systems, probably 70 of them dealt with rockets. So we had 70 different values, one in each operational system, that equated to the very same rocket contract, equated to the very same rocket that got launched. This is where IT flips out and goes, well, wait a minute. I have this business concept and this business key. The business key is ABC123. That's supposed to be a rocket, right? Yes. From the business perspective, that's supposed to represent that whole rocket through its entire life cycle. But it doesn't represent reality. The reality at Lockheed was 77 different values that all equated to that one master key. this is where the Data Vault talks about it's important to identify your data from the business perspective and the business construct. And this is where we get into taxonomies and ontologies, but tying all of that data as an asset to value to the business concepts across multiple functional areas of the business. And by functional area, I mean finance, and I mean manufacturing, and I mean planning, and I mean parts, and I mean rework and Launchpad and NASA. I mean, we supported NASA and DoD and the NSA and Lockheed as well. So lots of different vendors, lots of different people touching the data, lots of different keys, parts, and numbers moving around. But at the end of the day, the CEO said, how many rockets did we launch this year? How well did we do with each rocket? Did we build the same rocket that we launched last year? How do I know how long it took? How do I track the rocket's progress through each one of the operational procedures or functional areas? These are the questions they were asking us to produce. And you can't do that without a focus on the business. And this is where the Data Vault really shines.
I think what's important, just from a business perspective, is understanding that Data Vault focuses on the business and that it focuses on the business terms to come up with a common language in communication, and takes those business terms and ties it to business processes. From a business perspective, that is what's important. That is the approach that the methodology begins and ends with as an overall solution. As you mentioned before, there are, some understanding how to build Data Vault right every time, everywhere is important. But I personally believe that the business has a big impact on the success of a Data Vault built right. And specifically, I think about ways that the business can impact the success of their own analytic solution. I'd like you to go a little deeper, if you would, on it. But one of them has to do with, business support of the chosen methodology. I think that's absolutely huge. I think I have seen where the business in certain aspects gets too deeply involved in the technical aspects of a build, seen situations and been in situations where there's no collaboration with IT. I've seen situations, and I think this is the most typical of all, where business starts up an analytic solution or a data warehouse or data lake, and the first thing they hit IT with is, we want all the data, which is, people in IT, when they hear that, they laugh, but it's true. We want all the data. And I can speak personally. I had a client come in and say, well, we want all the data. Specifically, they were talking about a PeopleSoft system. And I laughed, because I said, you do realize that you really don't want all the data. You do realize that there are thousands of tables inside of PeopleSoft. Some of them are system tables, some of them are lookup tables, some of them are data tables. You don't want all the data. So let's step back and properly scope this. We don't want to boil the ocean here. We want to actually start delivering value to you. How can, if I'm a C-suite level or an executive level business user, a manager, making decisions on how our business is best served through an analytic solution, what would you say to them with regard to, this is how you can support the success of your analytic solution, whether it's Data Vault or something else?
I'd say first on the list is proper training. I don't mean just haphazard training or, oh, look, this is a $99 blue light special at Kmart. That's not what I'm talking about. Would you trust a brain surgeon that got their training for over the course of 1 year at some podunk college somewhere that probably doesn't even do brain surgery? Or would you trust a brain surgeon that has loads of credentials on their wall, has done hundreds of operations under the watchful eye of the medical board and has a medical license and the whole 9 yards? Getting proper training from the proper resource, which is why I started with authorized trainers and authorized training partners, is so important. So as an executive or a C-suite, backing the people to get the right training is one of the first stops that you need to make. Now, as an executive, I can also tell you they're worried about time as well as cost. And they say, well, it's all fine and well to train, but then these people are going to run off like every other project I've tried in the past. They're going to run off down a black hole and I won't hear from them for a year. How do I deal with that? I think the responsibility lies with both sides of the fence. The business people and the C-levels and the sponsors need to trust that the training is done properly, but they also need to see results. I get that. And they need to see it in a fixed time, fixed budget type of perspective, fixed risk or minimized risk. And we can do that with a time box deliverables. We call it a kickstart. You sometimes call it a fast start. These are different things that can be offered by any of the ATPs. I think doing a fixed time box deliverable and organizing the deliverable up front before the contract is signed gives the executive or the sponsor a way to say, I don't fully trust it or fully understand it till I see the results, but I know I'm going to see, on the other hand, I'm going to see results in 2 weeks. So at the end of that, there will be something that comes out of that pipeline that says, yes, we can, or no, we can't. And here's what happened. Here's what worked and here didn't. But training is baked into that. So we spend 3 days or 4 days, or depends on how the training is split. Sometimes it's split into half days, which extends the timeline from 2 weeks to 4 weeks. But the training is really 3 days or 3.5 days worth of time, and then followed by 7 days of implementation. Those are business days. So this is very important, but this is the difference between training from a qualified, quote, brain surgeon or a qualified person like the authorized trainer that has been through the rigor, that understands the materials, the edge cases, the infalls, the outfalls, the issues, the risks, and the mitigation strategies, and somebody you find on the web offering a blue light special for $99, or somebody you go out there and say, oh, well, they only train on the model. Well, yeah. In fact, there's a story there. Before I get to the story there about training on the model, I just want to say the developers, part of the responsibility lies with the developers too. It isn't just about the Datavault model. It's about the methodology and the architecture and the implementation best practices as well. The developers need to focus on moving data through the pipeline and getting data in front of the user inside of those 2 weeks. 2-week agile sprints are proven. We've gotten teams down to 3 or 4 days or 24 hours worth of iteration where they can move brand new data through the entire pipeline and out in a development environment out to the dashboard in 24 hours. There are ways to do it and there are ways to get fast at it, but the developers tend to wander off into this land of putting data into the warehouse that's never seen or heard from again. That's not a Datavault problem. That's development analysis paralysis and not applying the proper scope to the project that they're focused on. So there is such a thing called fail hard fast, and we all know this. And again, I stand on the shoulders of giants with Datavault, and I come from a long history, or have learned a long history of data architecture and true data design and all those other wonderful things that we talk about, process design and business as well. And I actually have a minor in business administration and management information systems. And not many people know that about me because I don't think I've ever said that before. But the point is, I do understand the business. And I know what the business needs, and the business needs outcomes. If we don't build it in time, they're going to go around us no matter what. They're just going to simply build it in Excel. Why? Because they have to. Why? Because they need an answer. That's one of the indications. When you see skunkworks projects pop up, IT is taking too long. They're not doing something right. They're getting stuck in the cogs or in the wheels. They're not properly scoping. This is the number one issue. They don't understand how to properly scope the work across Datavault to get it done. Now, that said, the Datavault model, the Datavault methodology, and the Datavault architecture are all geared to be incremental or modular in terms of the way they're built. So you can draw a scope bubble around specific business concepts that we talked about earlier, build a few tables and connect them together like Legos, right? As you move, and you can build an enterprise system. And by the way, enterprise system is a journey. It's not a destination. Yeah. You don't ever arrive there. You know, it's a journey that takes time, and you incrementally build it. So what you really need to do is balance between process and how you build and how quickly you build, the amount of work that your team is ingesting, the amount of data that is coming out the other end. Now, when someone says, I need all the data, I say, great, no problem, but it's not going to be in the first iteration or the second or the third. It may take a while. We'll get there, but it's going to be an incremental. What I do is pair the statement back for business and say, what is the right data right now? What is the one biggest, longest standing pole that is the biggest thorn in your side today? What is the manual set of processes? Do you spend 4 hours or 6 hours or whatever doing something manually that we can automate for you through an analytic solution and get it down to 2 seconds or 10 seconds worth of work? And we talked about that in one of the podcasts earlier as well. So to continue on with this thought and just sort of finish this up, because we're now nearing almost the top of the hour for this podcast. I want to talk about a few different things, but the business really needs to breathe and have confidence in the process, as long as you've got the right authorized training partner involved in that process. And the team needs to also give it a chance. The team needs to have an open mind to learn new skills and then build it. And if at the end of the build, they don't like it, no harm, no foul. They can say, well, we don't want to go this way, and they can choose not to go Datavault, and the risk is mitigated. The amount of money that the business spent on it is mitigated, and then there's no more talk, right? There's no big time failure after 3 years. And, this is the problem that the businesses run into, is these never ending projects. But I do want to talk a little bit about some of the other quote certifications, the other trainers that are out there, and why they're not the right fit. So once upon a time, when I came out of Lockheed, I did mention this in 2001. I produced a set of specifications, and I started talking about the Datavault model only. I had the methodology, I had the architecture, but the industry wasn't ready for any of that. So, CDV, Certified Datavault Data Modeler, CDVDM, was born. I actually wrote the original test. I wrote the original spec. I started certifying people as a data modeler only in Datavault. The idea was that you had to be a data architect and understand a data modeling tool to get that certification. That was the starting point. That was what I envisioned it to be. That was my prerequisite, but it got distorted along the way. I don't really know what it is today, but we have evolved. And, it's okay to have a Datavault modeler certification. There's nothing wrong with that, but it isn't the complete picture. It's not enough to build a solution. This is why I created Datavault 2.0 and CDVP2, Certified Datavault Practitioner 2.0. The practitioner really focuses on the model, the methodology, and the architecture, the multiple pillars that we have in the data warehouse and the enterprise analytics solution that needs to be there. This is what Datavault 2.0 brings to the table, a full solution build, including common language and common definitions and standards and methods and best practices and implementation guidelines and everything else. These are the pieces that are missing from the Datavault modeler certification. And I'll go back to my brain surgeon analogy. You could have a model of a brain on your wall as a poster. And that's could be the best model in the world. It could be a 3-dimensional model. Maybe it's projected off of a box in 3 dimensions in your office, and you can walk up to it and put your hand in it and split it apart and look at it sort of like you're, in one of those 3D movies. But it could be the best model in the world. But unless you understand how to build it or how to operate on it, or you've been trained in the methods and the procedures, I don't want you as my brain surgeon, right? You could be the best model in the world. You can look at the model, you can build the model, you can have the most beautiful model, but if you don't use the right concrete mix for the foundation of your high rise, it's going to fall down. Okay, and this is why we have Datavault 2.0 is for the rest of that foundational piece, how to build it, the right processes, and everything else.
Well, I love the fact that what the solution offers as a whole is not just the, if you will, the framework pieces on what needs to be built, but the methodological pieces of how exactly to build it. And I think that's extremely helpful to teams going forward. If we could, I know we're over, but I like to see if we can't finish up a couple things. In the next podcast, I'm just going to say what I want to do is get into a little bit more on some of the holes, if you will, that exist in some of the, I would say, some of the other modeling techniques, and specifically in looking only at models versus a holistic approach that includes the method and the architectures, the implementation guidelines that are missing in some of these other concepts or frameworks. But I don't want to I want to do that from a business perspective, because as a business person, I want to know just enough to be informed on what my IT folks are coming to me with, so I can make an informed decision. But are there any stories that you have where, this sort of model focus perhaps has created a failure, or has not brought the resiliency, I'd say, that the business is expecting? Can you share any of that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I got a couple of quick ones, and they have very long tails, but I'll keep them as short as I can to try to illustrate the point. As I just stated, you can have the best model in the world, but if you don't implement it properly, it can and will most of the time fall down or cause a failure. So there was a telco, there were several telcos, one particular telco I'm thinking of, and I cannot tell you who they are, unfortunately, that actually tried to build everything to a T to match the Datavault model. They built the quote technical terms we call hubs, links, and satellites, which are business concepts and descriptions and associations. For those of you in business, that's really what that is. So the telco built a Datavault model, and they showed me the model. And I said, well, the model looks good. And they said, yeah, but we're having problems here, 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 and here. Can you help us? And I said, well, obviously not without a contract. And that's where things got sticky. All of a sudden, they sort of went quiet. 6 months went by, and I contacted them and said, where are you? And the contact person, I had two. I had a friend inside, and I had a contact person that I didn't know. The contact person never responded, still worked for the company. My friend had left the company and sent me a response, because I blind copied this person. And they said, well, it went on. They tried to build it, but they didn't have a clue on the methodology and the implementation. So of course they were loading it wrong. They had bad data in there. They couldn't verify. They couldn't audit. Nothing worked. They had multiple copies of the same hub, or business keys were split around. They basically built what we call a source system Datavault. So the model was beautiful. It had all the moving pieces. It had hubs, links, and sats. Now, if you look at a car engine, here's the analogy. If you have a car engine, it would have had probably 6 or 7 car engines that were all strung together by multiple distributors and different. They tried to create a V8 from 2 different car engines that had V4s or had 4 cylinders in them. Right? You can't create a V8 that way. A V8 has to be designed and then printed and stamped and metal set up and poured, and it all has to be assembled together to work together. That's what a V8 does. And a V6 6-cylinder configuration, same thing. You can't just create a 6-cylinder by taking an engine with 1 cylinder, several motorcycle engines with 1 cylinder, and strapping them together. That doesn't create, a V6. And I love Bill Inman's quote here about data warehouse. And he says, a school of fish swimming together does not a whale make. And so this is really where, the telco fell down, is they didn't understand the methodology or the architecture, and they didn't follow the standards for implementation, right? So they got this beautiful model, but in the end, they fell down. We had the same type of story at a financial institution, but it wasn't where they had parts of the model that were beautiful and parts of the model that were absolutely ugly because they broke the standards in parts of the model. They said, well, we're special. We have this case. And for this case, we have to adapt the model this way. And I said, no, that's not. And they said, well, we're the customer. We know better. We know what's right. And we're just going to go that way. And then they ultimately failed. Right now, this was after an hour's worth of review. So don't think I was involved in that project either, because I wasn't. It was just a review. And then a credit card company that I found out about had a very similar approach. They tried to model every one of their source systems in separate independent data vaults. And then they were wondering why they weren't getting integrated answers. You can restructure your source data 10,000 different ways from Sunday, but that's really all it is restructuring your source data. That doesn't bring you business value. If you don't focus on the business, you won't get business related answers. And that's the point.
All right. So we've touched on a lot of things. We've gone a bit over time. I want to continue this conversation in episode 7. I want to get a little bit further and with particular focus on contrasting, if you will, Datavault to some of the other approaches out there that the business has probably heard of and may have even worked with, depending on their path, their career path. So thank you for your time today. Folks, stay tuned for episode 7. We're going to pick up on this again and talk more about Datavault from a business perspective and what you can do in the business to support your analytic efforts.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. And make sure you get up and get some exercise. We'll see you in the next podcast.
Is that a hint for them or us?
Both, I guess.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
Take care.